Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Aparna from IIT Bombay, and I'm going to talk to you on the module on gender in the Indian cities. The paper comes under Sociology of Urban Transformation. So let's discuss what are the learning objectives of this module. This module gives you a broad overview of the relationship between gender and urban space. It also explores historical experiences of women in the city. And in doing so, we will also look at the reflections of a few important theorists and how these theorists have looked the relationship between women and a space in the city. Further, the module investigates processes of inclusion and exclusion in the city from the perspectives of diverse gendered and sexual identities. Lastly, it explores the notions of fear and safety in the urban context. Several questions emerge when we think of the relationship between women and the city. Let us, for example, for a moment, reflect on our own experiences in the city we inhabit. How often do we venture out into the public spaces of the city? What are these public spaces? We have elaborated the idea of public space in module 6.7, but for our purpose here, we can count on parks, marketplaces, streets, plazas, malls, clubs, and resorts as public spaces. So let's ask a few more questions. What are the constituent features of public space? Do these public spaces offer equal opportunity to all the people to access their spaces? Are there certain spaces where you feel more comfortable? And why do you feel so? Are there certain spaces where you feel unwelcome, fearful, or maybe out of the place? And why? What kinds of activities define your interactions with these spaces? Do your interaction with public space differ when you are with a group of friends loitering on the street and when you are so solitary in a neighborhood park? Do you express freely in public space, or do you often put up a performance of acceptable behavior? So, your answers to all of these varied questions will most likely depend on your gender, on your class, race, caste, sexual, national, and religious identities. So, in this essay, we will address these questions from the perspective of gender, and we'll try to reflect on the gendered experiences of space in the city. You might wonder why it is important to investigate gender in the context of the city. As Lefebvre pointed out, our cities historically are shaped by varying ideologies and power relationships. Let us take the example of one such ideological constructions that has shaped our cities, that is, the public versus private binary. Feminist scholars assert that the public and private binary is not an innocent natural division, but it is central to the framing of gendered roles and subsequently to the allocation of power and resources. Feminists have critiqued a simplistic binary which assigns women to the private sphere of the home and portrays the home as a safe haven that is not open to scrutiny. The second wave feminist slogan pointed out that the personal is political, and several studies thereafter have demonstrated how the home can also be a site of violence and fear. Cities continue to embody this ideology with the separation of the sphere of production and reproduction and with notion of proper place for women and men. Several scholars have brought the understanding of the production of space like Lefebvre and place like Messi 1982 to bear upon the construction of the urban. Space is seen by Lefebvre as a product to be used, to be consumed, and which is also a means of production. Drawing from Lefebvre, geographers such as Doran Massey, David Harvey, and Edward Soja have encouraged us to think of space as a socially produced. Their project formulates the theories of space and place in the context of social relations. And in order to develop deeper into the question of how cities take shape and in turn shape us, it is very important that we investigate this mutual construction of the city and gender and space. Simone de Beauvoir famously proclaimed that one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one. She argued that social discrimination produces in women moral and intellectual effects so profound that they appear to be caused by nature. Feminists used the sex or gender distinctions to discuss that while the biological differences are fixed, it is the social conditioning of appropriate behavior that produces men and women. Subsequently, the sex or gender binary distinction too was critiqued due to its inability to take differences between women into account. The category of sex too was shown to be socially constructed. For example, Jagger has argued that because women are seen as subordinate to men, they do not receive adequate nutrition and therefore their bodies are not as strong as men. In this way, a social ideology constructs biological difference. The debate is still on about the relevance and usefulness of the sex or gender divide. Gender is a social relation that is fluid over the course of one's lifetime, historically and geographically contingent, and is produced by what we do rather than what we are. For example, we know that the manner in which women's and men's roles were defined in our families in early 1900s is very different from the way they are defined today. Social relations between women and men vary significantly as we shift geographically from the matriarchal communities of northeast India to the strongly patriarchal Haryana villages. Notice how the meanings attached to being a boy or a girl change as you perform social relations with your kids and kin over the course of growing up. Judith Butler has argued that gender identity is performed and that there's nothing natural about it. She avers that male and female bodies do not necessarily masculine and feminine gender identities, and that gender identity is nothing but an effect of a performance. In her world, gender is repeated stylization of a body, a set of repeated acts within a highly regulatory framework that congeal over time, produce the appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. The effect of gender, hence, must be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movement, and all the styles of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self. Understood in this way, gender relations are socially constructed and are context dependent. They vary over time and space. Despite having argued that gender identities are fluid, we also know that most people do not ascribe an element of intentionality to their gender performances. Gender does not appear to be fluid or open to choice. In fact, it appears to most as fixed identity that enables and constrains them in different ways. Think about little girls being chastised for being boisterous and not displaying their feminine attributes of shyness and servitude towards elders. Think about little boys being made to feel ashamed for crying. It is not that girls' bodies are naturally attuned to being demure and shy, or that boys do not have tear glands. However, by repeatedly reinforcing certain behaviors over others, we solidify gender. These repeated gendered relations also materialize as spatial relations, such as in notions of public and private space. Space is not a neutral backdrop over which gender identities are performed, but is an active component that also structures the dynamic gender enactments. It can therefore be said that both gender and space are mutually constituted, that is, they construct each other. Every action happens somewhere at some time. It needs a space and it needs a time. So, social processes then are also spatial and temporal processes. Over everyday actions and our social relations manifest themselves in certain spatial configuration and therefore produce space. These spaces in turn play a role in shaping our identities and allow for certain social processes while inhibiting others. If spaces are so integral to the nature of our social relations, then it is imperative that we understand our spaces in an attempt to understand ourselves as social beings. Transformation in economic and social lives, such as the coming of industrialization or colonialism, are bound to have had a role to play in the way our gender and spatial relations are shaped. Gender and the city. Industrial production of goods caused a major shift in the way economic and thereby social activity was organized. Factories were set up in urban areas and were surrounded by congested tenements for migrant men workers. In pre-industrial societies, men, women, and children had all participated in economic activity, which usually took place inside the homes. A spatial segregation of economic from social activities resulted in somewhat fixed gendered roles and spheres. Women's appropriate place was considered to be her home and her work as largely related to reproduction, whereas men were to venture out and labor in the factories. They were seen as the producers. The spheres for home and wage-rate work became clearly demarcated, especially in urban context, with their respective gendered connotations. If seen in public space, especially if unaccompanied by a man, women were suspected of being of loose morals. The roles of men and women and their appropriate spatial locations strictly scripted at the turn of the 20th century, particularly for middle and upper class women in cities of the industrialized world. Cities in these parts of the world were also acquiring particular forms. The Chicago School of Urban Sociologists, in analyzing our shift, discussed the spatial segregation that was emerging in American cities of the early 20th century. Their concentric city model marked spatial concentrations of population based on race and ethnicity and demarcated the business core from the residential peripheries. Though they did not explicitly discuss gender, the diagram showing the central productive core and domestic periphery implicitly marks out men and women's places in the city. Feminist scholars view such segregated landscapes as a material manifestation of our patriarchal and capitalist societies. In Chicago, too, in the late 19th and early 20th century, such segregation of spheres and defined roles did not go unchallenged. Once women started using public transportation such as the steer car or tram to come into the city center and were meeting each other in lunchrooms and theaters, they began organizing efforts for political and social action. The struggle for women's suffrage and subsequently after Second World War, the equal pay for equal work movement both began in urban context. Using the term municipal housekeeping, several upper-class women fought for better services in the city and reorganized garbage collections, clean milk, and activities like maternal and child care. They campaigned for women's political rights, arguing that taking care of the city was a natural extension of their roles as caretakers of the home. Women were at the forefront of the relief efforts after Great Chicago Fire of 1871 and sought to recreate the city as more livable rather than more profitable. Notable in this regard are the efforts of Jane Addams, Hull House that afforded livable housing and services such as libraries and bathhouses to reason in the city much before in the city municipality gave a thought to such public services. Feminist sociologists and geographers have also discussed how the urban landscape changed after the Second World War. It is often remarked that cities moved from being centers of production to zones of consumption, and one might assume that such a shift might make the city more a woman's domain. This was the time of high modernism and centralizing planning. With all political and economic power in the hands of men, the mid 20th century city too emerged in a highly masculinized image of rational planning with strict zoning laws. Moreover, the emphasis on the suburban homes and the automobile further isolated women from city centers. Early sociologists presented this as a natural division and glorified the image of home as safe haven and sanctuary. However, by 1980s, writings emerged that critiqued the fixed land uses as limiting to women's options in the city. Keller, in her edited volume entitled Building for Women, wrote against planning ideals and locked outdated gendered stereotypes into the built environment. Dolores Hayden's classic article appearing around the same time asked, what would a non-sexist city be like? In answering that question, Hayden advocated cooperative housing where cooked food and childcare would be provided by a union. She called for a coming together of men and women in establishing a union that she called Homes, that says Homemakers Organization for a more egalitarian society. Gender, like any other category of differences, does not work in isolation. Other aspects of one's identity, such as class, race, ethnicity, age, and so on, combine to affect one's opportunities and position in life. This concept is called intersectionality. In the context of the city, we see that middle and upper class women experience the city very differently from their working class sisters. Working class women, apart from working in the factories, were also employed in the domestic spaces of upper and middle class women. So while their work was rendered invisible, the middle class women were able to go out and participate in public life. Working class men, particularly those belonging to immigrant groups, on the other hand, struggled against poverty and discrimination. In order to preserve some sense of self respect, these men held on even more strongly to notions of working class male solidarity and hegemonic ideals of masculinity. Urban ghettos that had emerged as a result of economic and social transitions in the lives of immigrant populations also became zones in the city where these notions of masculinity translated into territoriality and gangs. Let's also discuss how the city becomes a space of inhibition and fear versus the city as a site for liberation. City as a site for liberation may be an ideal that we often wish to achieve, while city as a space of inhibition and fear is another condition and experience for many, and especially women. Several scholars have also highlighted that women more than men are fearful of public spaces in the city. Valentine discussed this fear as a spatial expression of patriarchy and as limiting women's choices in their engagement with city spaces. Women are most fearful of rape and sexual assault when they are passing through unknown territory in urban areas. It is paradoxical that even though women fear being out in the public spaces, they are most vulnerable to sexual violence inside their homes. It is now widely recognized that in most incidences of violence against women, the perpetrators are either family or friends or close acquaintances. So there is also an alternative perspective to the one that views a city as inhibiting women's access to city and city spaces. In her book entitled The Sphinx in the City, Wilson averred that the city offers a liberating potential for women. Its large space and the anonymity that the city offers lend itself to freedom. Women can escape the narrow confines of tight neighborhoods where their movements are monitored and experience a freer movement in the space of the city. Moreover, the city spaces create opportunities for celebration and public gatherings that enable women's participation in urban activities. Let's talk about gender and the city in Indian context. In December 2012, an unprecedented number of men and women in Delhi took to the streets to protest against the lack of administration's interest in making Delhi a safe space for women. The protests were triggered by the brutal gang rape of a young middle class college student who was returning home after watching a movie with her male friend. The incident changed the discourse related to rape and brought a previously taboo subject into the public space. A special commission led by Justice Verma sought public opinion on laws related to violence against women and received an overwhelming number of responses. The recommendations from this commission were with great urgency translated into law. While the protest and the actions that followed have all played a major role in initiating a discussion on women's safety, we still have a long way to go. What has been your experience? Are cities today safer for women than they were in 2012? What else needs to be done? While some scholars have argued that the historic cores of many of today's cities, such as Jodhpur, Banaras, and Ujjain, are spaces where women feel safer and more comfortable than they do in, say, the newly emerging urban spaces and urban hubs such as Gurgaon or Noida, they attribute this difference to the human scale, pedestrian distances, and the dense urban environment of collective life. According to this argument, cities are safer when city streets are more than just zones of circulation and function instead as extensions of homes, shops, and community spaces. However, modern cities are designed for private automobile, which most women do not own. Moreover, the inward-facing and alienating built center of these cities does not allow for free engagement with the space of the city. Most of the design's public spaces, such as city parks, office commons, and such like, are single-use spaces and are largely occupied by men. In contrast, women, if seen hanging around in public spaces without a visible reason, such as grocery shopping or accompanying their children to the park, they are considered as loose women. Indian law also reinforces such an understanding of appropriate and inappropriate behavior in particular spaces. While sex work itself is not illegal, the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act 1986 makes it illegal to solicit for sex work in public spaces. Thus, any woman who does not subscribe to conventional notions of proper dress or appropriate body movement is suspect and can potentially be picked up by the police. There is much public discussion on women's dress, movements, and activities. It often happens that even when a woman is raped or subjected to sexual harassment, she is blamed for being at the wrong place at the wrong time, or of wearing wrong kind of dress, or carrying the wrong kind of look or image. Such an attitude raises question about women's right to be in public space on her own terms. On the one hand, women in India find greater freedom and mobility in urban areas as they distance themselves from rigid caste and gender hierarchies in their home communities. On the other hand, it is the same patriarchal structures that take on a different form in the urban context. For example, scholars have pointed to the lack of public toilets for women in urban, also in the rural spaces. On surface, this might appear a trivial matter, but what it does signify in the mindset that women are not meant to be occupying public space, their correct place is the home, and they should stay there. By not making urban spaces well lighted, secure, accessible through public transport, and having basic amenities such as public toilet, urban planners have ensured that women's access to public space will remain limited. Even where public toilets for women exist, there is a sheer disparity in the number of toilets available for women and those for men. Considering that any given time a quarter of the women are menstruating and that women in any case need to take longer while using a toilet, it is a blatant denial of women's rights as citizens to not have adequate infrastructure for their needs in public space. It is also a common sight in urban areas to see men urinating along a wall. Women respondents in a study on Mumbai articulated feelings of embarrassment and discomfort when passing by a man urinating in public space. Differential engagements and expectations with urban space for both men and women create an uneven access and comfort levels for both the genders. Why should both women and men not be able to participate equitably in urban activities? Urban space is both reflective of and constitutes social relations. So one's gender, along with caste, class, ethnic background, amongst other social categories, plays a role in shaping the urban experience. So the experiences of the city for a middle class woman vary significantly from that of the working class woman residing in a slum. Let us take the same example as in the previous paragraph of the public toilet. Women living in the slums do not have access to private toilets and therefore are dependent on the use of public toilets. In the absence of public toilets, they are compelled to go outside, where they are often harassed. Public toilets, even where they exist, are often damaged, unclean, and dark. These areas too are seen as sites where women feel insecure. In the absence of infrastructure for even very basic and private facilities such as bathing, the working class woman is many times more vulnerable to sexual advances and harassment. This participation, however, is usually only temporary and it relies on a masquerade of womanliness. However, the politics of gendered identity emerges as a uniquely urban phenomenon, especially when we look at the history of queer movement. City spaces have created possibilities for non-heteronormative understandings of space and gender. LGBT movement gained momentum in the aftermath of the 1969 Stonewall incident in New York City, where the police raided a bar, seeking recognition of their claim to public space. Gay and lesbian activists have since then led many parades and gained favor with the public. Gay and lesbians pioneered gentrification in the inner city areas of Chicago, New York, San Francisco by bringing in cultural and economic activity into these spaces. You know that gentrification has a contradictory effect on the inclusivity of city space. On the one hand, urban landscape for gay and lesbian communities gained a foothold in the city. At the same time, by raising housing rent, other working class and minority ethnic communities, particularly African American, they were displaced and compelled to shift to peripheral paths. Let's talk about expanding gender and let's talk about queer spaces in the city. It is only recently that issues of sexuality are being studied in relation to the urban experience, and that gender itself is being understood more broadly to connote not just women, but also masculinity and homosexuality. Earlier studies, even if they addressed non heteronormative context, they applied a moralistic and or straight approach. Their work focused on violence in gay ghettos or promiscuity in gay bars, often placing gay populations alongside ethnic minorities or criminals. Such studies, although they brought attention to different sexual identities in urban context, are now critiqued for their implicit racism and for not including the perspective of the queer populations. Gays, lesbians, and transgender people have very different experiences in the city when compared with heterosexuals and even when compared with each other. Simple acts like using a public toilet, shopping for clothes, taking a train can all be uncomfortable for those who do not fit neatly into the male female binary. Transsexuals and transgender people also face discrimination when looking for housing or employments which are structured according to the heteronormative ideal of a nuclear family. In the Indian context also, gay and lesbian populations are discriminated against and harassed, socially and legally, and are therefore not visible actors in public space. However, this is fast changing with the homosexual community in India claiming their space through gay parades and pride walks. Most metropolitan cities in India, particularly Delhi, Mumbai, and Kolkata, have hosted these walks. Article 377 of Indian Penal Code makes homosexuality illegal, and therefore the gay subculture in India is yet to make a more permanent visible presence in urban space in the way it has done in several cities of the West. On the other hand, the transsexual, which includes hijra, kuti, and hosri, identity was recognized by the Supreme Court in 2014. Even before that, Indian cities have always seen a visible presence of transsexuals, mostly during weddings, birth of a boy, and festivals. However, they are often feared or revered in a way that makes it impossible for them to engage with urban life without being referred to by their sexual identity. So let's conclude what we have learned in this module. In this module, we saw that gender, like any other category of difference, does not work in isolation. Other aspects of one's identity, such as class, race, ethnicity, age, combine to affect one's opportunities and position in life. This concept is called intersectionality, and therefore, combinations of intersectionalities also determine one's spatial accessibility in the city. We have also discussed that the conceptualization of women as someone in need of protection and the discourse on women's safety is inherently limiting. If such a goal is met through exclusions, surveillance, and control over women's engagement with urban space, then women's right to the city is never established. Several authors, like Shilpa Phadke, those who are also covered in this module, have argued that the right to loiter has the potential to change the terms of negotiation in the city public spaces and create the possibility of a radically altered city which is not just for women but for everyone. Through several cases and examples, we have also seen that the exclusion of women from public space is intimately tied to the exclusion of other marginalized groups, especially the lower class migrant male. Certain groups are perceived as threats to the middle class women's safety, and therefore their presence is seen as illegitimate in urban public space. Often in popular discourse, such individuals are considered unfriendly bodies, and they are held responsible for making the city dirty and insecure for the so-called middle class. The market and state appropriate such construction of threat from the lower class migrant men to further their agendas of consumer-friendly and world-class secure city. According to this new logic, women do become legitimate users of public space, but only when they are consumers. We need to think further how and why are certain bodies declared unfriendly and their presence discouraged in public space. How can cities be made safe for women while at the same time it should accommodate competing claims to public space? You might have come across several cases of rape in Indian cities, especially Delhi, which is now being called as a rape capital. We've also seen that in Indian context also, gay and lesbian populations are discriminated against and socially and legally harassed and are therefore not very prominent and visible actors in the public space. However, in recent time, this is fast changing with the homosexual community in India claiming their space through gay parades and pride walks. Therefore, in order for cities to be truly inclusive and for the diversity of urban life to flourish, we will need to address the differential needs of all, be it men, women, transgender, or transsexual populations belonging to various ages, caste, religions, classes. So, lastly, I would say that for the right to city to become a reality for all, we still have to go a long way.